let's go. Hello again and welcome to a new episode of Things They Don't in Florida, a project with and by Martin Spangberg and invited guests. Today we have Amanda Beech with us from Vienna. And just to say that the project, it was initiated by Crimson Coast Dance in Nanaimo, which is an island, or is in a city on Vancouver Island, west of Vancouver. So in time zone wise, this is right on the other side of the world. And the project started with an interest in what do dance do when the theaters are closed. But now the theaters are open, so we are making a project that looks into how can performance, dance, theater think about contemporary technologies, not necessarily using it, but letting technology, and particularly an internet-related technologies, reflect our work and us reflecting it, so to say. Amanda, originally educated in the UK, and since 12-something years at CalArts, is somebody that I have followed her work for many years through connections in the UK, especially in regard to a publishing house called Urbanomic, that was very strong in promoting and thinking through new realism and what was then known as speculative realism. Amanda became part of this context as an artist and writer. And for me, it was very interesting to follow her work in the sense that it really processed forms of realism into an understanding of what is aesthetics today, how do we appreciate art, what is art's, so to say, job in contemporary society. And for me, this was very important because I saw a little bit of too much of work during these years that sort of became obsessed by post-internet aesthetics, and rather than thinking through technology, sort of illustrated it either positively or as a critique. But oftentimes what happened was that these forms of work actually promoted what they were critiquing in respect of, after all, we are using the technology in the direction that the technology wants to be used. So perhaps a slightly too long introduction, but there we are. So welcome, Amanda. And you're in Vienna currently on a excursion to the Vienna Art Academy, and have just come back from the Venice Biennale. I'm not going to ask you what you thought about the Biennale, but that we can do over coffee another day. But I wanted to ask you, how did you start out your work, and how did you become fascinated or interested in new realism and speculative realism at that time? For me, namely, it was very important with how Negarestani, Graham Harman, Ray Brassier, and others were somehow the first people that said no to the navel-gazing post-structuralist situation that we had at the time, where art became so kind of defensive. And then there was a voice there that said, fuck no, we are thinking differently. And I mean, for me, the very important was Quentin Meyersu's book that somehow really went bananas on 200 years of a philosophical tradition. And at the same time, to me, speculative realism also somehow, how can one say, restitutes a sort of Kantian way of thinking, making it, because to me, around 2005, 2010, to say Kantian aesthetics was dirty and bad. And I felt that was perhaps important to speak Kant again, because where do we end up if contemplation of art is becoming banned? Don't we then have to consider that aesthetics and ethics play on the same ball field? And that for me has been a complexity that I wanted to sort of figure out something about. So maybe you can start with telling us a little bit where you come from and how you came in touch with realism.
Yeah, thanks, Martin. There's so much in what you were talking about there, and if I've got time, I'll try and contextualize it a bit in something that happened or was part of my practice way back, like when I was 18 or something, right? Way before the time before I met or read any work that was associated with speculative materialism or speculative realism. But I guess as a young artist, I was really concerned or was frustrated with the idea that the art academy that I studied at, and also in general in art, we were not allowed to talk about totalitarian art or fascist aesthetics. They weren't considered to be art, and if they were like bad art. They were like the worst art you could think of. And I wanted to find out why. And I, obviously very young, so I was thinking, just asking these simple questions. And one of the answers, which is not necessarily just about political violence about these works, was that they claimed to have a unity between what they said and what they did. That they were unified in their capacity. So that's why people might call them propaganda or advertising as opposed to art. So there was this kind of course, this idea that anything that could claim unity with what it was talking about would not be allowed to be called art. And that the only artworks that I should be looking at as a good artist would be artworks that could claim to occupy or focus on the rift between saying and doing. That there would always be this tension between the two, and it was art's job to speak to failure, impossibility, dissonance, noise, the sublime, if you like, the kind of limit human understanding. And that if art didn't do any of those things, then it was going to be really bad art for various reasons, politically, structurally, philosophically. And so I kept thinking, well, why? Like, why is it? I mean, really, why is it bad? Because we know that when you consider that an art that produces disunity or speaks to a pluralistic fragmentation, like, let's say, for example, Jackson Pollock's work, right? Like standard version of, the fragmented picture plane. We know that these works were key to also being forms of propaganda for American liberalism. It's not that one art that looked dissonant could be more free, let's say, than the art that looked more straight or unified. So I got very early on, I was really concerned with this very hard and fast rule that had been applied to the politics of art making to make you a good, morally good artist. And so I wanted to explore. So that led me to the question of realism. This question of, how can an artwork speak to something that is unthinkable and unknowable, and claim some kind of unity with it that wasn't going to be theological, that wasn't going to be totalizing in a fascistic or, like that kind of totalitarian Stalinistic way. Like, how can we? And it wasn't going to fetishize the opposite, which is what I saw capitalism doing. So, between Stalinism and capitalism, you've got these different aesthetic registers, let's say, that we'd inherited as artists, and that we were supposed to kind of always opt for the capitalist aesthetic, the pluralistic, diffracted site of difference. So understanding that, as many people have said, including Zizek, talked about totalitarian liberalism. I kind of wanted to find a new kind of realism, like to claim, well, how can art say something about what reality is when reality is full of complexities, and I'm not just going to make some metaphysical picture of how reality really is and screw it up into a ball and say, there it is, now I've done it, there's a totalized picture of the universe, thank you very much. So how do we understand what reality really is, and how can art like retake that sight without constantly talking about its own failure to do so? So often art's articulation of realism is to say, I can't do it, here are my limits, I must profess my own hubris and feel guilty, like a middle-class guilt, or I must confess, I must be humble in the face of this task. So the idea of like re-engaging Kant, as you were saying, was to re-invoke this question of the ought, the kind of question of the telos of thought and the responsibility that humans have to think, rather than say in a kind of nihilist, a kind of accelerationist Landian nihilism, which is full of irony and the nihilism of nihilism, if you like, where we surrender to the conditions of the given, if you like. I want you to say, well, actually, there's traction to say, to kind of rethink the capacity of meaning again, rather than just have this sight of cause. I wanted to think about how art can reason through structures in aesthetics, rather than just, again, say, all reason is bad, all reason should be condemned because all reason requires transcendence. And instead, I wanted to say, well, transcendence is something that we do. We always are representing. We're always saying something about something. So why don't we try and say that something with rigor and correctness, rather than act as if we can stop doing it? So in that sense, my Kantian parlance, if you like, is to say, well, transcendence becomes a kind of form of pragmatism. We're always representing anyway. So how do we kind of think about the labor of our productions of meaning in the world and how they perform in artworks? And just to finish my point, I guess, I've been working in this terrain for so long, and I'd been very, it's not a sad thing, but I'd been very lonely because most of the people that I knew were doing kind of forms of Derridian irony or Deleuzian vitalism, and neither of those things, as I've hoped to have just described, were satisfactory for me. So I met a few people like Quentin Meursault, Maya B. Chronic, and Ray Brassier, and I was delighted because they too had certain inflections of pragmatism in their work, whether they were explicit or not. And that's something I was really interested in. Like, parts of my work are really invested in like theories of language and analytical philosophy, but also there was this kind of work through continental philosophy and Marxism, which I was really identifying with as well. But ultimately there was this question of, we can say something about something and it's okay. Not only is it okay, but it's necessary to do so, rather than act as if we just surrender to this Heideggerian phenomenological space of letting things be and withdrawing into matter. So I really thought that there was something about language in their work that talked about the value of what it means to make meaning in the context of a space of like a genealogy of causes where we all feel like there are no grounds in the world. So that post-structural space is very much present in the sense that we live in a time of groundlessness. We start from a kind of post-truth nihilism, but at the same time, within that space, matter matters, things matter to us. And there's a kind of question of agency and determinism in that respect, even though we might diagnose our human situation as being one of indeterminacy and kind of feelings of like a fatalism towards our catastrophe with the death of the sun and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
So for me, yeah, it really allowed me to like engage a way of art making, but with all the philosophy that I've been interested in, but also now with more affiliations with other thinkers, which I hadn't had before.
Indeed. For people that are not familiar with the vocabulary, when we speak about realism today, we don't speak about realism in the sense of realist painting or some sort of British cinema from the 80s about sad people in Manchester or whatever, but realism rather in the sense of an attitude or an understanding of there is more to the world than language, which was a sort of a strong post-structuralist position. We can maybe not have access to things and the real, but we can still practice and believe that there are opportunities to get in touch with. And so realism that showed these sort of new forms of realism that showed up around 2007, 2010. There was an understanding that proposed an understanding that yes, art operates in the world, but it doesn't mean that all that it can do is contained in meaning that is already available for us, so to say. Yeah. But to me, this is spot on, and from my perspective, at the time, my experience was that there was also a very low level belief in what art could do in the world, more than confirm it either by being positive to it or being critical to it. But it was still laboring within the already available. Or one could then say that art became a commentary on the world rather than what I understood with forms of realism that showed up at the time, that art could actually do something to the world, not causally in the sense of a reaction to what the world already is, but rather in respect of insisting on or evoking ways of thought that didn't already comply with thoughts around or with discourses already available. So even though it is strongly, as you say, there was something peculiar happening with language, with thinkers and artists at the time, but it was also somehow a belief that language is not necessarily, as I thought at least, not necessarily the realm of art.
Yeah, I mean, there's a few things you're touching upon there that I think are really crucial to like pull apart a bit. I mean, the first thing you make me think of is how inherently we are, as art, when I say we, I'm talking about people making art, right? Just for now. We are often taught, ideologically cultivated, to think of art as a space that begins and ends with the subject, the expressing subject, the emoting subject. So what I mean by that is that art cannot get involved with any form of scientificity or rational scientific thinking, whatever form that might take. And I say whatever form that might take, meaning that I'm not just talking about hard sciences here. When I talk about science, I'm talking about, say, Marxist forms of dialectical work or other forms of thinking through the mathematizable or the kind of theories that are borne out in physics, for example. So it was always that if art was to get involved in any of those types of rational thinking, they would only be there as a kind of illustration or a semantic triviality in the artwork. They wouldn't be part of the methodology of the work or something that the artwork could actually grasp in a real sense. So if you're kind of under the impression, as most of us, I think, in general are, in especially Western discourses, but also in Eastern discourses as well, that art is a space of pluralistic, private, subjective expression, then then it will always be based around subjective idealism. And so if art wanted to speak about anything that's beyond the capacity to perceive in the world, like beyond the senses, it would only be able to gesture at the limit of our perception, and it couldn't grasp what was beyond the limit of perception, because art's wrapped up in the optics of human capacities alone, being highly subjective. So if you take that view, then all art can do is play within the world of the sublime. You know, it will always be subjective, idealist, romantic, no matter what form it takes, whether that's a postmodern art that talks about its incapacity to meet Godot, for example, or an artwork that is traditionally sublime, you know, in the early romantic sense of like Turner, for example, the phenomenology of, you know, the waves of a Turner painting, where we can feel everything, but we cannot know it. And then in, you know, for example, in symbolism with Redon, we have this idea we can know things, but we can't grasp them. So either way, there's this limit capacity to subjective experience. And instead, in what I was interested in with the question of realism is a kind of scientific realism, in the sense that could art really take seriously as a practice, like the question of consciousness and knowing and understanding and judgment, all these kind of questions that might take us beyond the question of subjectivity. And of course, this comes back to questions around alienation in the political and how we experience ourselves as subjugated in capitalism, but also how we might experience ourselves as alienated in terms of Hegelian spirit, like, you know, this idea of the project of the human is like never knowing itself, but in the process of. So I guess maybe I think I'm digressing a lot from your questions now, or your comments, but I just wanted maybe to kind of extrapolate upon this question of the subject and this question of a scientific capacity that art might have that had completely been taken away from art in the invention of aesthetics, and also that art would just be this kind of have this amazing capacity to be equivalent to the ineffable, and for me that just always brought art back to this subjective plus theological space. So what is it for art to engage in a kind of scientificity or a scientific kind of process? Can an artwork think through the capacities of objective conditions of the world, or even the objective conditions of the subject that makes it, without simply saying, I am just worthless in the world, you know? So for me, it really keeps bringing us back to these questions of subjectivity, objectivity, these old kinds of questions. And, you know, quite rightly you say, you know, that the question of realism is not a question of social realism, what I might call, or, you know, soap opera realism, or verisimilitude in the sense that, you know, or kind of questions of mimesis, in the sense that, you know, we want to copy or mirror something that exists in the given. But as we know, you know, realism is about a question of what is beyond the capacities of both what we can imagine and feel. And are there techniques or technologies that we can invent in methodological practices that kind of are instruments to allow us to think past the limits of our own given imagination, the one that is given to us often by capital.
Indeed, I think this is crucial and very important. To me, there is a difficulty in the sense of how a lot of art that I come across proposes a critique to asymmetries in the world, forms of suffering, forms of law, forms of dealings with minorities of different kinds, climate change, whatnot. But and fair enough. But what concerns me is that the methodologies of the critique, or from where the landscape from which the critique stems, is properly liberal, if not neoliberal. So it comes as a paradox here. Sort of, we want to critique something, but we want to do it from the ball field that have put us into this situation.
Yeah.
And to me, this is then it's problematic for me that I come across a lot of art that indeed mistakes commenting on the world from taking or assuming a political position.
Yeah. Yeah. It's incredibly fraught, the thing that you're describing, in the sense that, you know, if people realize what you've just said, right, then they often narrate that back through the artwork, which then becomes like a doubling down on the crisis itself. So I see this a lot in the art world. I see that, oh, I'm aware that that my critique is born out of the ideology which I oppose, and I'm aware that my critique supports the ideology it seeks to oppose, or even invents it by the back door. So now I'm going to make work about that. So there's this kind of like terrible ontological regression that's kind of borne out by the procedures of critique in itself. And you know, of course, this is a historic problem with some forms of Marxist critique, and the question of self-consciousness, and how the self-consciousness of critique is, you know, essentially another bourgeois prop that maintains the middle class in its position, maintains structural difference by dint of its own self-conscious critical methodologies. So, you know, on the one hand, so I've got some kind of things about that on the one hand, I think that giving up on the question of consciousness and just, again, being a kind of new materialist or a vitalist is not the answer. But neither is being an ironist and just professing the irony of one's position all the time. So I think, you know, as for my practice, I do think that the question of mediation, meaning, and consciousness are still really vital. And then the question becomes, well, you know, what kinds of consciousness is art capable of manifesting? And rather than just, you know, like you've been saying, it's the confessional, you know, oh, the hand wringing. And how does art speak to political inequality? You know, when the means by which it speaks to it often reinforces it. I think this is your question. And, you know, one example of that is the deep problem of, you know, the title of the Venice Biennale, which you were saying I've just been to, and you know, the title of the Venice Biennale is Strangers Everywhere, or Foreigners Everywhere. I know there's many translations around that because the Biennale is a global event, of course, but you know, just before we even think about the Biennale, just taking that phrase is indicative of this problem, I think, because if we look at that phrase of something being everywhere or all, speaks on the one hand to our, you know, ontological experience of being alienated in capitalism. We're all alienated in capitalism, right? We're all kind of subject to the conditions of capitalism, all globally, like most humans are, right? I would say, we could say all humans are in some oblique way or direct way. So it's very kind of important to think about that existential condition of alienation. But it's also important to not collapse that with the kinds of alienation that some people are experiencing capital, which are excoriating, horrific experiences. So to say that we're all alienated, or we're all strangers, or we're all foreigners, or all this idea of the all is very difficult, because it often collapses the existential into the political so quick that we begin to not know the difference between the people who are genuinely eliminated from the scene of the political, in terms of, like, you know, refugees, enslaved workers globally, minorities, and so on, in respect to, like, us all feeling like victims in capitalism. So, you know, we can have Elon Musk could write a book next week saying how he felt abused as a child, or he grew up in a difficult home or something, you know, just as a hypothesis. So, and then confess his own abuse in the systems of capital. But we know that that's nothing like the kind of structural abuses that people face as minorities in capital today. But so the problem is, I think, is that we can't, the art world is actually obscuring the difference between the political, empirical suffering of people in the political, and us all feeling like victims as well. And I think that there needs to be some kind of structure of decision, the way in which we can pass out these differences, rather than just collapse it all into, like, well, we're all suffering in capitalism, and so that makes you feel better about buying one of these artworks if you're a rich, you know, art dealer, whatever.
To me, it's interesting to think in respect of this, recalling Chantal Mouffe's understanding of agonistic politics or antagonistic relations, because, as you say, well, in order to be foreigners everywhere, we still have, we first of all have to introduce ourselves to a discourse that is the discourse of Venice Biennale. And what Chantal Mouffe then missed out on is that, well, in order to generate an antagonistic situation, you have to be involved on the platform of politics in the first place, or whatever domain this is, no? And but to me, there is something curious here, as you also mentioned about foreigners everywhere, is how the political and the existential seems to be involved in some kind of lace patterns or whatever, and that is particularly problematic for me, and where neither is political or existential problematic, but putting them together makes problems. And we can recall this from discourses in regard to abuse, or what happened over the last 5-6 years, where there are lines of thought from the performativity of an individual being of a certain behavior through regression suddenly becomes existential, meaning a person is a predator ontologically, so to say. And this it's difficult for me, and perhaps art's job is really to put them apart and to insist that they are apart. But for me, I'm interested in how, coming back to forms of realism again, in regard to if art's domain is language, so a post-structuralist tradition, then it cannot not be political, whether actively or not. But at the moment when it is political, it is also inscribed in ways, information of knowledge that is already available. So perhaps I'm curious, I was interested in either, no, art's domain is existential, but we don't know what that existential is. So an encounter with art is not to say, oh yes, I agree, or oh no, I don't agree, but rather is in front of this artwork, I don't know how to form an opinion or take a position or orientate myself. And in that moment, yes, you can go home or just sort of visit a cafe and Tate Modern, fair enough. Or you can say, in this requires me to generate a position.
Yeah.
Not to decide upon this or that, but it's a matter of generating a position. And that generating, for me, is crucial in the sense of generating a position is also, perhaps one could relate this to sort of Italian 80s or 90s philosophy in the sense of Virno, etc. And then to generate the position is also to form a form of multitude, which is a position to which politics have no tools to relate. Or thinking it over Deleuzean terminology, that would be sort of provoke the possibility of event, which again would be to a reformation of knowledge in a non-probabilistic manner, so a contingent form of shift of knowledge.
Yeah, I really feel affiliated to what you're saying. It's like a kind of ideal version of art for me. Like if I achieve that in my work, I'd be extremely happy. I think, but you know, in breaking that down, the way I'm understanding what you're saying, and or the way I would see it, is that first of all, we all come from somewhere. Like we're all in the world, ideologically produced, and yet call me call me an idealist, but I do believe that we have the capacity through certain technologies of thought to think beyond those conditions, and it doesn't just mean like just popping up some spontaneous imaginative bubble in your head, you know, but actually laboring through certain processes and techniques and technological conditions that we might invent for ourselves, or tools and instruments, or even each other, right, as one of those tools to develop the possibility for the production of a model that could be called art or a book or film or whatever we call it, but a piece of theatre, in other words, a staged environment that allows us to indulge that sense of freedom, even if that freedom is utterly, you know, of course, constructed and structural. And I think that's one of the kind of advantages of, let's call it the bourgeois system of art, is that the freedom that it produces, whilst being completely illusory and part of a problematic system, also has the capacity to manifest free thoughts. And I mean that in a precarious kind of way, because these free thoughts, like I say, are not about spontaneity and just, oh, I had a thought today, but they are products of kind of rigorous practice and thinking. And I think in that sense, yeah, we all come from a political condition, but there is a capacity in this space, I hope, to solicit propositions, or to produce propositions that not only generate the capacity, or demand perhaps even the capacity, that a viewer or an interlocutor has to think differently, or has to rethink the conditions from which they arrive, but the very model in itself is doing that too. So there's this kind of fascinating construction, that the construction might catalyze the possibilities for other thought, but it is the possibility for another thought in itself as well. And there's a kind of twin kind of version of it, you know, like there's the object that's produced, whatever that is, that's the proposition in the world that has actually happened, and it's real and material in front of you. And then there's the experience of interpreting or being with that object in when it's starting to produce what we might call a public, because it'll be the more than one. So for me, what you're saying, or how I'm understanding it, is this kind of really kind of the space of the possible, where the possible is not anything can happen, like it's not arbitrary, because it comes from all these roots of thought. First of all, the mechanisms of the production of the object, then the manifestation of the object in the world, plus the person's interaction with it as a viewer. All of these conditions then hopefully can come together to demand together a new way of being in the world, or a new capacity for what thought can be understood to be. Which might be the fact that, you know, one demands a new way of speaking. And part of that might also be, as we've seen in many artworks, is the capacity to rethink methodologies and ways of working that have been eliminated from our horizons due to colonialism and imperialism. So I'm not just saying it's all about the new, but also the capacity to take from other resources that we might have eliminated through certain forms of dogmatism and bad political ideological thinking. So I think in the mix of all this, I am really optimistic for the capacity for art as a propositional model, both, like I say, implanting the demand, which has content, in the sense that, yeah, you can't think of anything. It's going to push you in a certain direction, but we cannot say what that is.
No, I think this is crucial. They're very, very crucial. And there's maybe something to clarify a little bit from my perspective, is that that we can use thinking differently in at least two different registers. So this artwork made me think differently about. That would be one opportunity to say it opened up for the possibility for me to think about this environment in a slightly different way. But this for me is still a reactive form of change. So yeah, because of who I am, I could now see, and then the artwork also then already knows what the proposition is. So we are going to inform you about that you should preferably think otherwise about ecological differentiation or whatever. Yeah, fair enough. But then maybe there's thinking differently through a different register, which interests me, is that I'm encountering something to which the ways that I pursue perceive the world does not have relation, meaning that it is not a matter of considering the possibilities of how I can think, but rather there needs to be a different in kind thought generated. So Deleuze does this, as we know. He differentiates between change in degree and change in kind. So yeah, change in degree is like, I rather go to the bio store to buy my apples. That's an alternative, but it's only still within the same system. And then different in kind would be to generate something that insists on a different in kind thought, namely a thought that is, so in other words, it's not an alternative thought, it's an altogether different thought. And to me, this is where that's art's job, to sort of generate those opportunities, the possibility of these forms of encounter. But of course, it also implies that the artist cannot know where a different in kind thought might bring us.
Yeah.
It might bring us somewhere really unfortunate, but at least it's not where we are. So we can do something different at that position, so to say, no? And I mean, recalling Badiou, how he thinks about revolution, he's saying that, well, we should remember that revolution is not going to be a better tomorrow.
Yeah.
It's not derived from where we are today in favor of. It's going to be a different tomorrow, and probably quite irritating, preferably very irritating. Otherwise, it's again, we can also say this in respect of transformation is not the work of art. It's a change that has rather to do with a breach of consciousness than a continuation. And I'm recalling this now. I'm speaking too long, maybe, but okay. So change of direction. So now. It's interesting that you have spent time in California, and I'm interested in how in respect of woke politics, of a sense of that the artwork is a prolongation of the subject making it, and if it is not, the artist might be understood as somebody who's done bad or whatever. I'm recalling a situation where Beck was brought to court because of a book called Platform, and the proposal was that he wrote a book that he should be accountable for as an individual. But I'm writing a book. A book is a piece of fiction. So that I find that this was important at the moment of the day. No, the artist is not causally related to the artwork. But in a situation of contemporary discourses around safe space and so on, there might be other takes on this, which I think is complex and difficult in regard to precisely the positions of art that we have been speaking about today.
Yeah, I think that, the terrain you're speaking about, it brings us back to, of course, that question of the artwork as a site of expression. And I think that, it's not just a new thing, obviously. I mean, I remember in the 90s when, we had like a kind of neo-Dada moment with the YBA artists, and there was this movement which was really interested in like resituating the local experience of a working class person, the tabloid reading, fag smoking, like kebab eating, punk, post-punk style nihilist 30-something in London or whatever. And I'm bringing this up because many people read this moment in the art world as a kind of rejection of conceptual art, of analytical work that had been so important in late conceptualism and conceptual work, like when we think about art and language and Kossuth and the Marxist kind of movement around, dialectical methodologies in art. And so this kind of move to occupy the space of the other, like the working class Philistine, was this kind of, occupation of a standpoint of a particular identity. And I'm not saying that's the same as today, but I see a common thread in the sense that there's a general fear of universals still, which this movement had. There's a general fear of the word reason. There's a general fear of the idea of mentioning that art does representational work. because all of these things index the idea that art is speaking on the behalf of others. And that, of course, is a form of subjugation and mastery. And so in many senses, you know, these movements that come and go in art around standpoint theory, the personal as the political, and, you know, whether it's Philistinism or certain forms of affect theory and woke kind of politics, they very much, not all of them, but some of them really value the testimony of individuals and the autobiographical. And I think that in the political, it's really vital that people's testimonies are heard and shared and worked through. How that becomes a general model for the production of an artwork is a very different question, because we are like collapsing these conditions into one, and I'm very concerned that we shouldn't just simply go, okay, because it's good to hear from marginalized voices in the sight of the political, the whole of art practice should be diffracted and pluralized in a flood of individuated voices. Because the question then is, who is the we? Where is the collective voice? How can we think about the question of universals coherently and properly? And so whilst I was, you know, critiquing this universal idea of alienation just a few moments ago, I'm actually only critiquing its collapse with certain empirical registers. I'm not saying we should give up on universals at all, because we do urgently need to speak to something that we all share in capitalism, because without that capacity to think about the generic condition of a human in capitalism, we give up on the human altogether. And I'm not simply saying, oh, I'm advocating for a new form of brand new humanism, but I am saying that we'll give up on humanitarianism too quickly. If ironically, by privileging the individual voice as the only voice to be heard, we actually give up on humanitarianism. And that sounds, like I say, like totally contradictory, but I really believe it to be the case, because it just pushes us back into the atomized confessional space of individual stories, where you'll never understand my story because I want you to empathize with me, but you can never be collective with me because my story is so unique of my own suffering. And I think that we need to see structural alignments between individuals and groups. And I think, you know, when I think back to, you know, the way consciousness raising worked with the Black Panther Collective, I think these are really good examples of how affiliations were made across massive gulfs in political identity groups in the name of anti-capitalist initiatives. So yeah, I don't know if that really answers your question, but I think that somehow art has to find its place as a vigilant tool around these questions of aesthetic expression.
Certainly, but I mean, it's very interesting to think through how art's position as a political means, if I can use that as a word, in regard to American traditions or the US traditions and European traditions in respect of social movements and in regard to how art's job in Europe has given an opportunity not to be a social commentary, since we have had the welfare state operating in a very, very different ways than how it did in regard to, for example, the Black Panther movements and so on. And but I find it troublesome at times that how there there are an understanding that art's relations to politics are not also shifting. So there is some sort of idealized way for art to deal with politics, which seems to be situated somewhere in a sort of a second wave of avant-garde from 1958 to 1974 or whatever, where that was the political moment, and that's how art should relate to politics. But to me, there is a very peculiar, important situation, as you also say, that how if the individual has been, let's say, commodified, fully inscribed or co-opted by capital, our first necessity would be sort of, how can we generate forms of universality, or even forms of community, that is not based on the understanding that the subject is your property, that it is sellable, investable, etc. Sort of Judith Butler and her thought, brilliant and enormously important. But what we also need to be aware of is that, well, as much as we scholars praise Butler's ideas, it was also a great idea for contemporary capitalism.
Yeah.
Well, if we are all performative, then that means that the subject is fully incorporable into capitalism. So maybe we are sort of doing this as a refrain, but a difficulty for me is that if universals that we need to strive for cannot be conditioned by contemporary capitalism.
Yeah.
And here is where I find art is extremely important currently, is to generate the possibility of spaces or times where these universals can start to emerge and grow. That exactly is then not artworks that are dealing with subjectivity in regard to a sort of a causality in between the artist and the artwork.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, I mean, this comes back to the idea, I guess, what we were referring to, or I was trying to sum up, is like the kind of the space of modeling what that could be. And, you know, you were also saying earlier that when we think about a universal, we can't tacitly say what it is. You know, that and I think that's where the question of like what I've called it, of techniques, but also of technologies come in. And when I say technology, I'm not just talking about, you know, like computational tech, but I'm talking about even just the technology of being social with each other, in any kind of question of like, how do we even like start off with what are the aesthetics of a conversation, what are the methods of a conversation, what does it look like, as well as what happens in terms of its form and content and structure. So all of these questions become really important when we start to like have that very let's say close encounter with materials, which is what happens when you make a piece of work, where everything gets looked at almost like, you know, kind of when you make a work, it's almost like we're always already making some form of analytical cubism, because you're looking at everything from every angle and turning it around and inside out whenever you make a piece. And I think that the capacity that art has to, in its disciplinary techniques that are very old and, you know, continuing in many ways, is that it has the capacity to have a healthy skepticism, right? Not just a paranoia that everything's false, but it knows when it has a pragmatic skepticism, I would say, that it knows when to say, this is where this is what I'm using as my ground because I need ground no matter what to build something on. And what's the construction site I'm using here today? Because if we go around, worrying about everything, we'd never make anything. So I think there are certain, when it comes to this idea of the universal and the inexistent condition of what a universal is in the world, it demands fiction. And what I'm saying is these fictions also demand certain pragmatic tendencies or accepting certain givens. We can't just question everything, or else we wouldn't be doing anything. And at the same time, there can be certain forms of speculation and hypothetical constructions or modal extensions that are produced in this making of universal conditions that allow us to test if it holds. And I think this goes back again to what we were saying before, that you could say many artworks do this all the time, but whether it holds or takes hold is a completely different thing. That you could have something that's completely correct, like a very correct version of a universal condition that we might even not have the capacity to recognize as being correct because of the world we live in, which blinkers us to recognizing it as a language even. So I think that what this all reminds me of is the question of kind of how art has to participate in a kind of form of time travel through its fictions. And it might not be ready to be in the world for 100 years, but it could be made last week in a garage in Bedfordshire or something. Like we don't know. But I think without the commitment to do it, I'm not just saying, oh, we live in a world of accidents where we'll discover something and then we'll all gather around it like Space Odyssey moment. I'm not saying that. But I am saying that, there are certain paths of knowing that explicate themselves in their own construction and then, demand understanding, but they might not be understood as well.